This video will show you how to replace the front press-in wheel bearing and hub on a Mitsubishi Lancer. This will be located behind your front wheel. Let's get into it. Okay friend, let's get started on our job. Safely raise and support the front of the vehicle so the wheel's off the ground. Now once you've done that, you're going to remove all 5 of your 21mm lug nuts so we can get the wheel off of here. Now that we have the wheel out of the way, we have a clear view of our front brakes. We're paying attention directly in the center at our axle nut. We're going to remove the axle nut. You can see that we do have a locking cotter pin. We'll remove and dispose of that. We'll be using a 32mm to remove our axle nut. There's that. You're typically going to also find that you have a washer. A quick inspection will set each of these aside. We'll use some penetrant in this area to help break it free. Continuing on, we need a hammer and punch directly in the center of the axle shaft. We don't want to use a hammer directly on the axle, which could cause damage to this threaded portion. Now you can tell that we have movement from that axle. We can continue on. Now let's make our way towards the back side of the brakes. We can see where the rear of our steering knuckle is. This is where the outer tie rod end connects into it. We're going to be separating this. Our tie rod has been replaced. I'm going to be using an 18mm for my mounting nut, and we're going to separate this. A quick inspection of the hardware. We'll start it back on a couple threads. Now continuing on, to separate this, we don't want to use a pickle fork or something that's going to go in between this area and potentially damage our protective boot. Use some penetrant along the top and tap on this area lightly with a hammer. The vibration should help break it free, and the mounting nut is going to prevent it from falling down and potentially hurting us. A thorough inspection of the outer tie rod end to confirm there is no visible damage. This looks good. At this point, you can pivot this as necessary. Now we're going to start removing the brakes from the area. Before we remove the caliper, let's make sure that we have the rotor held in place with one of our original lug nuts. That's going to prevent it from falling off. Now as I'm pivoting this, we can see where our caliper bracket connects to our steering knuckle. Right down along this area, we have 2 17mm bolts. I'm going to fully remove the first one and we'll start it back in a couple threads while we continue on to the second mounting bolt. Now as we start removing the caliper, of course we do want to hang it aside and we don't want to put any pressure on our flex hose. So with that said, we need to have a small hanging hook which we're going to apply to our coil spring on our front strut. We'll be hanging the caliper directly from it. Like I said, we don't want to put any pressure on that flex hose, so let's go ahead and dislodge it from this mounting bracket first. For this, it's fairly simple to just take hold of it and gently press it out of place. Now we should have plenty of room from this area. Let's continue on removing that bolt and hanging the caliper as I mentioned. When removing the caliper, take a quick peek at your brake pads. If it looks like they're worn at an angle or damaged in any way, it's a good time to replace them. These look fine, so I'm going to set it aside. Now let's remove our brake rotor. Just remove this lug nut. A thorough inspection of that brake rotor. That looks good. We'll set it aside as well. Now we're back over along the other side of the steering knuckle where we had dislodged our outer tie rod end from. This is where we can see our ABS wheel speed sensor wiring harness and the sensor itself leading down into the knuckle. This is held in place with a 10mm bolt. Remove the bolts and carefully remove the sensor from that steering knuckle. Be careful not to break it off inside the knuckle. That can be an issue. Now, as far as this sensor is concerned, it's always a good idea to use some penetrant. That's going to help the removal process. As you can see on this one in particular, it is stuck in my steering knuckle. So we want to try to work that penetrant down and into the knuckle in between the sensor and the knuckle itself. I sprayed it down. Now I'm just going to lightly tap on it back and forth, trying to work that lubricant in. We'll be using some pliers here. We'll see if we can help this along. Now, as you can tell, I do have movement. This is a great sign. Continue on with the penetrant as necessary. Once you have a rocking movement like this, typically you can gently pry out and away at the same time. It should be broken free. Now, once we have the sensor out, of course, we're going to clean it and give it a thorough inspection. If it looks like it's cracked in any way, you're definitely going to want to replace it. This one's in good condition, so I'm going to set it aside. We're continuing on with this bracket up above here. This is part of the ABS wheel speed sensor wiring harness. We're just going to go ahead and dislodge it so we can set this aside. Our plastic bracket here. Now, as far as this is concerned, on either side of it, it does have locking tabs. You just want to carefully dislodge it. We can see those two locks right along there. Now we need to make our way all the way down at the bottom of the knuckle where it connects to our lower control arm. This is where we have our lower ball joint. Looking at the knuckle itself, we do have a 17mm headed mounting bolt that comes through from the front of the knuckle, through the bottom of the knuckle, all the way through to the far side. I'm going to hold the bolt head with a 17mm wrench. We'll be using a 17 for the mounting nut as well. There's our mounting nut. That bolt's actually sliding out fairly easily. Typically, you'll have to use some lubricant. There's our mounting bolt. We'll be using some penetrant in this area. Now, if you were looking at the steering knuckle itself, down along the area where the ball joint is, you're going to find that it has two ears, one here and one just along the forward side. Essentially, we want to make our way into that center groove and gently pry, separating the ears from each other. They can't go very far, but we do want to separate it just far enough that lubricant can make its way in between the steering knuckle and the ball joint. You can also lightly tap with a hammer if you need to work it in. Now, while I'm holding that separated, I'm also going to start tapping on this control arm. You can either use a rubber mallet or you could use a pry bar. Essentially, we're trying to draw the ball joint stud out and through that steering knuckle. Let's see if we got any movement. Now you can see that I do have movement in this area. That's exactly what we're looking for. Now we're not going to fully dislodge this yet. Once you do have movement, let's pause down here and we're going to make our way just up and above our front axle to where the front strut connects to that steering knuckle next. Now up in this area, we can see that we have two 19mm headed mounting bolts that come through from the rear of the strut, through the strut and the front knuckle, through the far side here. And on the opposite side, the forward side, we have a 19mm nut for each one of these mounting bolts. We'll fully remove the first mounting nut from the top bolt, but we're leaving the bolt in place as we continue on to the second mounting bolt. As we remove the mounting bolts, we'll be careful not to cause any damage to our front axle. Here's where we're pressing the axle through that front knuckle. We're separating the knuckle from that front strut. Now we're lifting up and away on the steering knuckle, removing it from our lower ball joint. Now I'm lifting up on this and I'll lightly tap on the lower control arm, driving that ball joint out of position. Let's carefully pull this away from the front axle. We're leaving the axle in place. Now let's get this safely over to our press. I have my steering knuckle in our press. It's as safe as possible. We have to make sure that we're supporting it so the hub is facing down, and of course there's an area underneath this that can catch that hub for us so it doesn't potentially fall down and hurt us. Now as far as where I'm holding, I like to try to make my way underneath this area as close inboard as possible. We have the ear where our outer tie rod end goes. Of course, we will be hitting a little bit against the backing plate here. We want to be careful not to cause any damage. On the other side, this is where the front brake caliper would sit, so we're resting across these two ears. As we continue on, pressing down, applying pressure, we want to be extremely careful not to cause any damage. We have hand and eye protection at all times. Now as I bring this closer, you can tell that we're not properly aligned here. We're going to take our time, make sure we're properly aligned and as safe as possible at all times. I can see that the hub is making its way down as it's supposed to. Typically, when you attempt to remove the hub, you're going to also destroy the bearing on the inside, which is fine, we're replacing it anyways. The next thing we have to do is pay attention in this area. We can see that we have a snap ring. For this, we'll be dealing with it on the bench. Now I've got this on the vise, holding it still for us. Looking along this outer aspect where that hub was located, this is where we can see our snap ring. It has two ears. For breaking this free, typically I like to use a hammer and a punch of some sort. Once you do have a little bit of movement, you would want to continue on with some snap ring pliers. So I'm going to try to grab onto one of these ears here, see if we can get some movement. Let's try the other side. As you can see, this side does have movement. I can make my way directly in between this area. I'm going to continue on with this side and see if I can get to break free first. You can see that I do have this broken free. I'm going to grab it with some pliers to see if we can work this out of position. Go ahead and clean this up, give it a thorough inspection, make sure that it is reusable, replace it as necessary. Now we're back over at the press, and as you can tell, we have this as safe as possible. Let's continue on with driving the wheel bearing out and through the center area here. I'm using my small adapter and we'll apply some pressure. We'll make sure we're aligned, of course. There we are, that's a good sign. Slow and steady wins the race. You can see it making its way out through the bottom there. There it is, friend. Prior to installation of any brand new parts, of course, we need to make sure we clean and inspect the mounting surfaces. As for this bearing and hub replacement, we need to make sure we clean up the knuckle area where the bearing is going to sit. That's directly in this port here. We can see all the way down deep inside this area, you have a flat level base there. That's where the bearing is going to press against. Make sure that area is clean. Also, you want to focus along the outer edge here, right where my finger is. That's where the small groove is for that snap ring or locking ring. We want to make sure that that's going to be able to be placed properly and not fall out of place. Go ahead and clean up everything. For that, you can use a wire brush and some parts cleaner. Now, after cleaning the port inside the knuckle where the bearing's going to go, just use a thin amount of anti-seize inside of here. You don't need very much, just a thin coating all the way around should do. You can use a brush if necessary. After that, it's time for installation of our brand new front wheel bearing. Now, if you were looking at the wheel bearing, you can see along one side, you have this darker magnetic ring. On the opposite side, you don't have the magnetic ring. We want to have the magnetic ring facing inboard, towards where the ABS wheel speed sensor would be. Now, I have my knuckle rested down in my press. I'm pressing along the backside. We have our magnetic strip facing down. When installing this, we need to make sure we're only pressing on the outer casing of the bearing. You never press on the inner race or anywhere in the middle area, which can potentially cause damage to the brand new bearing, in which case you're going to have to re-replace it. Now, since you just removed your original bearing, you should be able to take that original bearing casing and slide it right over the top there. It matches perfectly. We'll use a plate across the top here, and now we're going to continue on pressing this brand new bearing down and into the knuckle as far as possible, all the way down to that base that we had cleaned. Now, just as with the removal process, we need to make sure that we're as straight and level as possible. When we start driving this down, you don't want to be at an angle. That can cause damage to the knuckle or the brand new bearing as well. We'll take our time throughout this entire process. Let's just double check to make sure we're aligned all the way around so nothing's off-seated and potentially dangerous. We're pressing this down. I can see my brand new bearing sliding into place. This is going well. So as I was pressing this down, I can hear an audible difference between when the bearing was moving down towards that base and when it finally did hit up against it. I'm only going to apply a little bit more pressure here, and then we'll lightly tap on this area with a hammer, causing some vibration in case it needs to be brought down just a tiny bit further into the proper position. Okay, we've got pressure. Just a couple light taps here. We don't need a big hammer. Let's remove pressure from the area. Of course, we'll make sure we're holding onto this so it does not fall. The next thing we have to do is give this a thorough inspection. We're confirming that we can see that groove all the way around the knuckle where our locking ring needs to be. If you can't see it all the way around that circular port, you need to continue on pressing. This looks good, so I'm going to make my way to the bench to reinstall my locking clip. Now, as I mentioned, I cleaned and inspected my lock ring, so it's prepared for use. I'm going to carefully get this into my pliers, and we'll gently start squeezing this so we can slide it into place. Be extremely aware of any pinch points. They can be dangerous. Sometimes these easily slide into place. Other times you'll have to work them in. You could possibly have to use a hammer and a punch or chisel. You need to double check to make sure it's completely seated all the way around. This one's not. It can also be off in just one area, which could potentially be dangerous. So I'm just going to make my way all the way around, gently tapping it into the proper positioning. As I'm doing this, I'm making sure I'm only hitting up against my locking clip and I'm not driving in towards my bearing. As you can tell, this is seating as I make my way around. We're still being aware of any pinch points as we continue on. One last confirmation that this is completely seated, and we'll make our way back over to the press. Now we're over at the press, let's pay attention to our hub. We need to make sure we have this rested on this portion of the hub, directly in the center area here, and not, of course, up against any of our lug studs. So I have a small adapter for that. Now it's time to start installing our hub and bearing. Of course, we want to make sure we have it in the proper orientation. We'll be resting this portion of the bearing right over that hub shaft there. Continuing on, once we do have this in the proper positioning, we're going to have an adapter that fits directly over the center area of the brand new bearing on the race. Now this is fairly simple if you just take the original race from the original wheel bearing that you had just removed. Start bringing this into position. Now I have this rested on here. As I mentioned, you're going to want to have an adapter that presses up against the backside of the bearing. This is fairly simple. You can just use the inner race from the bearing that you just removed. Or if you have the proper adapter, you can also use that. Now, since I do have that adapter, I'm going to go directly against that inner race. I'm not pressing up against the magnetic strip, making its way around the backside of the bearing. That's going to cause damage, and you're going to have to replace the bearing again. We'll make sure everything's aligned here and continue on slowly pressing it into the proper position. You're going to be focusing along this area. It's going to squeeze right together. We're watching for pinch points down in this area. There we go. This is going down fairly easily. To confirm it's not binding in any way, you should find that you can pivot the knuckle, as you can see here. If it doesn't pivot, something's off kilter and it could potentially be dangerous. Okay, so as I was bringing that down, I can hear an audible difference from this. I'm just going to apply a little bit more pressure here. I'm making sure that it can still move, nothing is binding. This is exactly what we're looking for. Let's just have a quick peek inside this area. You can see that that's where it needs to be. We don't want to have a large gap here. That's going to cause an issue. We'll release pressure. Of course, we're holding onto the knuckle so it doesn't fall down and potentially hurt us. All right, let's get this over to the vehicle. Over at the vehicle, prior to installing that steering knuckle, let's make sure that we inspect our ball joint mounting stud. I like to apply a thin amount of anti-seize onto my ball joint mounting stud. After that, we'll pay attention to our axle splines. You can see all these lines right across here. We're going to apply some anti-seize into the splined area, but not necessarily onto the threaded portion here for the mounting nut. Now we can start installing that knuckle onto the ball joint. Just bring this up into position. Now I can see that it is sliding into the proper placement here. That's a good sign. Now that I have the knuckle slid down onto my ball joint mounting stud, I'm not going to continue on with my hardware yet. The next thing we want to do is take our axle and we're going to slide it straight through the backside of our wheel bearing. After that, we'll bring the knuckle up towards our front strut for that hardware next. You can see it going through there. It's making its way through the wheel bearing. We'll install the mounting bolts. Those are going to come through from the rear towards the front. Both mounting nuts there. After you have both of those on, continue on to snugging them and then torquing them to 81 foot-pounds. Now we're focusing down along the bottom where our ball joint stud goes through our steering knuckle. On the ball joint stud itself, it has a small slot, and that's for the mounting bolt to slide through. You might have to lightly tap on the lower control arm with a rubber mallet to bring it into the proper positioning. If doing so, just be extremely careful you do not tap on the ball joint itself, which could potentially cause damage. Rubber mallet just right on that control arm. Mounting bolt comes through from the front towards the rear. Get that nut on there. Now I'm holding the bolt head with my wrench. We'll snug this up. It started on. Now we'll snug it up and torque it to 52 foot-pounds. Double check to make sure everything's secured as it needs to be. Now it's time for our ABS wheel speed sensor. As we bring this over towards the rear, where the port is along the back side of the knuckle, let's also make sure we bring our plastic bracket into the proper positioning. Now if you're looking at our front strut, you can see a small groove here. This is where the tip, or the locking tabs, of that clip are going to be located. Just go ahead and line it up, press it in. It should be able to wiggle around, but definitely not slide out of place. We'll continue on with the ABS sensor. Now as for this sensor, we don't want to put anything down along the sensing agent all the way down here, but all the way up in this area where it goes into the steering knuckle, it really couldn't hurt to apply a thin amount of lubricant. You don't need very much, just something to help keep the moisture away. That's also going to help this slide into place. We'll bring it down into the steering knuckle and continue on with our mounting bolt. Now I've got this pressed down, but it's not completely bottomed out. We don't want to break it, so I need to continue on pressing until it's completely bottomed out against the steering knuckle. I can pivot it as necessary. Now at this point, it's pressed all the way up against the knuckle, and my mounting bolt port is aligned. We'll continue on with the mounting bolt. We'll bottom this out, and then I'm going to torque it to 80 inch-pounds. There we are. Obviously, we don't want to break the bolt, but you do want to make sure it's properly secured. The next step is going to be installing the brake rotor. Before doing that, let's apply some anti-seize to the hub mating surface, where the brake rotor is going to sit. Now, as far as installing the brake rotor, we want to look along the backside on the mating surface of the brake rotor itself. Confirm there's no miscellaneous debris. After cleaning that, let's get that brake rotor in place. We'll hold it there. We're using one of our original lug nuts again. Now we have the rotor on there, it's time for the brake caliper. Now as we bring this in position, we'll make sure that the rotor fits in between our two brake pads. Now that I have that in position, I'll start in my two 17mm headed mounting bolts and snug them up. The torque for each of these will be 81 foot-pounds. Now let's pay attention to our flex hose. We want to ensure it's not twisted in a way that could restrict brake fluid flow. Assuming it looks good, let's make sure we secure it in its bracket. Press it in, double check to make sure that's secured. It's time for the outer tie rod, and we're going to align the stud with our steering knuckle. After you slide it up and through, continue on with your mounting nut up along the top. We'll start it on, bottom it out. The torque for that is going to be 18 foot-pounds. Let's get the lug nut off of here. We'll continue on with our washer and our axle nut. Now as far as this is concerned, you're going to want to make sure you start it on by hand and tighten it using a hand tool. You never use an impact tool, which could cause damage to your hub or your bearing. Once we have that on, we're going to bring this closer to the ground so we can torque it to 129 foot-pounds. As you can tell, we're closer to the ground. You may or may not need to use a bar. If you do, you want to make your way across the lug studs here, as flat as possible so you don't cause any damage. Now the next thing we need to do after torquing it is pay attention to the ports on the axle shaft itself in comparison to the slots that are on the axle nut. We need to make sure that one of the ports and the slots are properly aligned so we can install a locking cotter pin. If for some reason it's not properly aligned, continue tightening the mounting nut until the very next slot is. One last quick inspection in this area, let's install our wheel. We'll start on all 5 of our 21mm lug nuts. Bottom them out, get the wheel safely on the ground, and then torque each of these lug nuts to 80 foot-pounds. The wheel safely on the ground, we're torquing these to that 80 foot-pounds in a crisscross manner. Torqued. Okay friend, we finished the installation of our front wheel bearing and hub. The next thing you need to do is make your way in the passenger compartment and pump up the brake pedal till it feels firm. After that, you're taking your vehicle for a road test, you're listening for any odd noises, and then get yourself a 4-wheel alignment. Thanks for watching.
When only the best will do, demand TRQ. The only company that lets you view before you do. TRQ is committed to offering the highest quality aftermarket auto parts that are engineered for peace of mind. Thanks for using and viewing with TRQ.